Hello and welcome back to my humble abode. Come on in, I kept your spot warm. Today we're going to be continuing our story about housing and how everyone in the whole country was given a safe and warm place to live. But trigger warning, that's not true at all. Countless governments, their so-called leaders, and the neoliberal system they uphold have failed to provide this basic human need through the choices they've made while in office, even though we could solve this issue today, all while saving money. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself, so we're going to start right where we left off in part 1. And I'm sorry for joking around when waffling over an issue like homelessness, but I really need people to watch this so we all have the facts to just solve it already. Now, where were we?
3 years ago, he lost his job. Soon his savings ran out, and he found himself without a place to live.
There's so few housing opportunities and so many people looking that they have the landlords have the pick of the litter, right?
Homeless advocates say low-cost rental units are drying up here too.
And if you can't find a place that's a similar rent to what you were already paying, which you already couldn't afford, then you're homeless.
I think everyone can agree that ending homelessness is a top priority, especially in a wealthy nation like ours. So what are the conditions on the ground? The 2016 State of Homelessness report shows that 35,000 people sleep on the street on any given night, and more than 235,000 people will experience homelessness for some period of time each year. While this used to be an issue faced largely by older men, the demographics are diversifying, and not in the woke way. Unhomed Indigenous people are overrepresented by a factor of 8 times nationwide, many of whom are being failed by commodified housing markets on their own unceded territory. In fact, the 2018 Street Needs report shows that despite making up 4% of the total population, Indigenous peoples represent anywhere from 10% of the unhomed population in Montreal to 40% in Vancouver and 80% in Regina. In Toronto city-run shelters, the non-white population makes up 74% of youth and 92% of families experiencing homelessness, as well as 80% of people in dedicated women's shelters. And for over half of the city's unhomed population, they've called Toronto home for anywhere from 3 years to forever.
In the shadow of a skyline marked with million-dollar condos lies a much different way of life. Tiana Snyman has been living in this 40-year-old RV while he's been working toward his master's degree.
I'm making a conscious choice to not pay rent and be able to afford going to school and finishing my education.
And none of these figures account for the 8% of the population 15 and older that have to sleep in places like their car or with family or friends, also known as hidden homelessness. Of that 8%, over half are unhomed for 1 to 12 months, and around 1 in 5 for more than a year. About 5% are a minority or an immigrant, while around 20% are Indigenous. And between 10 to 20% are people with a physical or mental disability.
People who are homeless, the over 235,000 Canadians every year, have higher rates, dramatically higher rates of chronic respiratory conditions, heart conditions, cancer, and mental health and addictions. All of those put one at higher risk of vulnerability once one's exposed to COVID. It's important to note that this is happening right across the whole country, and the challenge that we face is that we know what needs to happen. As long as people are living in shelters across the country, we're unable to deliver on all of the great public health guidance that we're getting in terms of social distancing, for example, cohorting. And as long as we have people in shelters across the country, they're going to be increasingly susceptible to this happening now and in the future.
The 2018 BC Housing Report puts many of these issues on display in the province's rapidly growing unhomed population. Nearly 60% have multiple health conditions. Half of these are people who have called their neighborhoods home for decades, and the majority have been without a home for more than a year. Because, well, the cost of living is simply too high, even though 1 in 5 are trying to pull up their bootstraps with full or part-time employment, while others who can't scrape by with government assistance. And, of course, COVID is in no way improving numbers that were already on the rise.
The numbers are staggering, but not surprising.
A 30% increase is far more than our economy can sustain, and now we know that homelessness is costing us billions of dollars. On the other side of that, hundreds of people are dying on our streets. This is a crisis.
Sweetie Pie JJ McCullough is right. This crisis is fueled by bad choices people have made. And unfortunately, those people are the ones writing our policy, like Maple Ridge Mayor Mike Morden.
People coming here to carry on doing drugs and basically raping and pillaging all of our community and our businesses, and that's got to stop.
In April, the city got a court order to dismantle a tent city. Last month, it banned panhandling. Kirsten Duncan was the only councillor to vote against the ban.
It criminalizes people that are homeless and people that are struggling with poverty.
The encampment destruction and displacement continued during COVID, and while the BC NDP bought hotels to house the homeless and create affordable housing, the city of Toronto was demolishing encampments at the same time as they told everyone to shelter in place, which is a really interesting choice.
We go to every shelter and the beds are so full, they're slammed.
Jason had been set up under the gardener until his encampment caught fire 4 days ago. Another gathering of homeless people had been a couple of blocks away but were cleared out a day later. In 2019, a total of 782 encampment sites were identified and 262 clearances took place.
This legacy of destroying what little these people have continued well into the summer. And I know what you're thinking, but why not stay in a shelter?
More than 600 cases are in the city's shelter system, and that's why a lot of people are moving to massive encampments like this one downtown.
We're suffering out here, you know?
While attempting to move people into those indoor spaces, encampments continue to be cleared away with heavy equipment.
The people have to cooperate with us, including some of the people who will, the minute we take an encampment down, move back there, and they're doing it as much as a political statement as anything else.
Is this just a statement? No, this is not a statement. This is for real. There are not appropriate shelters for people. It's risky sometimes to be in the shelters, and you can't even get into a shelter. So people have to be defended here.
Unfortunately, these concerns weren't enough for Superior Court Judge Chavez to stop the encampment demo. And this is an aside, but he was once described as incredibly sharp, practical, and knowing how to get to the heart of a matter by a former colleague. Anyway, Encampment Support Network kind of debunked this ruling, which claimed there's no evidence that shelter isn't available to people who are homeless. ESN say they've been on the ground with encampment residents for 6 months, and every day they call the intake hotlines just to hear there's nothing available. In fact, another lawsuit ruled that the city had not made best efforts to ensure the shelters were safe and physically distanced, which ought to mean the destruction of encampments would violate residents' charter rights.
I'm so sick and tired of staying outdoors all the time and getting wet. I think I want to be an inside duck.
The judge also cited the city's concern over a lack of sanitation, but seems to have ignored that the city has reduced portable toilets and wash stations, leaving only 14 park washrooms in the entire city, of which only 4 are open 24/7, and they're all on the island.
Can't I live here? Isn't there enough? You mean I've got to be an outside duck? Oh, quack, quack.
Meanwhile, cities across the country were quick to make special accommodations, turning bike lanes into patios and allowing bubble tents for a futuristic dining option.
Oh no!
And maybe we shouldn't be surprised. With his track record, it kind of seems like getting the least fortunate among us out of his sight is one of John Tory's hobbies.
I'm an addict, so society says this is where we belong, and so be it.
What do you say?
Well, I say they're not leaving us much choice.
Roger's right. A system that fails to provide this basic need to all while punishing those who create shelter of their own, well, it's kind of twisted. And although it pains me to admit, it was the government of Stephen Harper that created a large-scale trial of Housing First policy, aka providing free housing. Simple as that.
You're homeless. They give you a place, even if you're struggling with addiction. Why does that make sense?
We don't tell them how to live their lives. Because not everybody is in the same place, you know? Not everybody that lives in a house doesn't drink every day, you know? Like, maybe because they never experienced homelessness, that doesn't mean that, you know, they don't drink every day, they don't have a drinking problem, but they're able to maintain their housing. We're worried about helping people maintain housing.
Following a Senate report on mental health, the MHCC was created in 2007 with a mandate to use around 75% of its budget to study Housing First in 5 cities. Of course, the Conservatives neglected to fund new social housing alongside it, which is obviously the other side of the equation here. The investment in affordable housing plan was less than 0.1% of the 2014 budget, and the homeless partnering strategy had less than half that. In fact, Harper spent more on his own communications team than either of those initiatives.
Oh no!
And no doubt the trial was means tested to only consider housing for those who were the worst off, people who were chronically homeless and living with a mental illness. Harper ignored those who were only marginally better off, the precariously housed, working poor, victims of abuse and discrimination.
Are you ready for a story too? Good. And the name of the story is
Stephen Harper doesn't give a hoot.
So, lesson learned that housing first without a surge in social housing and safety net investments is still just neoliberalism that smiles only on a few. The at-home study flexes a few more useful lessons. In every region, those in the Housing First trial achieved 80% housing stability in just 3 to 6 months, while those in the Treatment as Usual trial never hit that mark 2 years later. They also felt a significant improvement in their ability to function better in their community, as well as a swift and stable increase in their quality of life when compared to their baseline or status quo counterparts.
It would be absolutely life-changing, and I'm deteriorating so fast, it's unbelievable.
We're saving lives, and we're saving the government money by doing this programming, because then they're not spending the money on hospitals for people that end up there that are experience homelessness, or the justice system where people, get incarcerated on purpose because they don't want to face minus 30 in the winter.
Data from the Toronto trial showed a dramatic reduction in emergency room visits, a lower frequency of contact with police compared to the status quo, and the number of arrests reduced by more than 60%. And for my fiscal conservatives, you'll be happy to hear that for every $10 invested to house the unhomed, $9.60 of savings was made up in other public services for high needs participants, $3.42 for moderate needs participants, and for those in the top 10% of public service use, nearly $22 of savings were realized. Geez, we can reduce the deficit by putting people in housing. What more do you want?
Since 2009, Edmonton has housed 10,000 homeless people using the Housing First model.
Having an apartment has given me the means to, have those dreams, have those hopes, have those aspirations. When you're homeless, you dream about being warm.
Unsurprisingly, people described having a home as a catalyst for positive change in their lives. They experienced hope, felt a sense of control and safety, and could begin their recovery. Many saw improvements to their connections with family, friends, and the community as a whole. Of course, it's not a silver bullet fix. Many still struggled to find work or education, and they still faced all sorts of discrimination. On top of that, while new financial supports were welcomed, most found programs like ODSP to be insufficient for Canada's high cost of living conditions. But with all this data, only the Liberals neglected to adopt some form of Housing First policy by the 2015 election. The NDP leaned on their bill C-400, which alluded to Housing First alongside cooperative housing funds and legislating housing a human right. That bill had died at the hands of Harper's Conservatives, who temporarily backed Housing First and went on to coast on their lightly funded Economic Action Plan. Only the Greens flexed rhetorical and financial support for Housing First with a guaranteed livable income safety net, plus an expanded co-op housing system and nationwide retrofits. And I saw provincial NDP from the Yukon to Saskatchewan to Ontario, and Green parties from New Brunswick to BC have adopted Housing First policy. And there's no reason a wealthy nation like Canada can't follow Finland's Housing First model, which virtually eliminated homelessness in just 10 years. 4 out of 5 people are now stably housed, but those who aren't yet have enough social supports to end rough sleeping. And they did it all while saving $23,000 per person per year. So what are we waiting for? We can end homelessness with pragmatic policy right now. Yeah, right now.
There are 5 million unused bedrooms in the province, and half of those are in the GTA.
And on top of that, as Comrade Matthew Green points out, we have 6 empty homes for every person who is unhomed in a year. The rate of ghost homes in our largest cities is growing by double digits, and some smaller cities and towns in Alberta have spiked in the triple digits year over year. But hey, at least we're better than the US, right? We already have 5 times their empty home rate and growing. Wait, that's not good. Our capital cities have doubled, if not tripled, the number of empty homes in the first 15 years of the 2000s. Of course, not every municipality has an increasing rate of ghost homes, but it's a phenomenon reaching every corner of the country and trending to a net increase.
That could mean a building is being renovated or the owner is traveling, while in other cases, it's just an empty investment property. A few years ago, Vancouver tried to curb the practice by taxing owners of empty homes.
And I'm open to exploring whether this would be the right measure for Toronto.
That pledge from the mayor was back in 2017. When it comes to Vancouver's vacant housing tax, it's not yet clear just how many units it's actually brought back into the market. What is clear is they've raised tens of millions of dollars in new revenue, and most of that is pinpointed for affordable housing projects, which begs the question why Toronto is waiting so long to decide if we're going to implement a tax like this here, when it seems there could be more empty condos in the city than we think.
Of course, it's not just empty homes. Before COVID, Airbnb turned more than 30,000 permanent homes into unregulated hotels. And it's not just traditional homes we can make into social housing either. Pre-COVID office space may never be coming back. Take Calgary, which struggled to fill office space at the beginning of the year, only to add enough empty square footage for more than 400 two-bedroom apartments by October. Reclaiming even a fraction of this space with mixed-use zoning would create homes and jobs, revitalizing areas of each city that typically only see activity in 9 to 5 hours. Like, won't anyone think of Ottawa? Our government is ignoring empty offices in their own backyard, even though the city declared the homelessness and housing crisis an emergency back in January. So it seems like we should be following Barcelona's lead and nationalizing all this would-be housing into a community housing trust to start, and then expanding on that by building social housing for basically the first time in decades.
We haven't built purpose-built rental housing in the private market here for over 30 years in BC, and we haven't built social housing for 25 years.
Experts say municipalities are largely left to deal with the problem on their own, overloading systems already stretched thin.
And that's challenging for any city. It's even more challenging maybe for some smaller cities that don't have a social planning kind of culture, that maybe don't have the housing infrastructure that a place like Vancouver might have.
That's a solid point. People being unhomed en masse in Canada is a relatively new phenomenon that just happens to coincide with dramatic cuts to social housing and welfare by governments nationwide in the 80s. Down from over 30,000 in 1972, by 1982 we still had 20,000 new units of housing built each year, but successive governments slashed that to around 1,000 new units by 1995. Like, geez, for the cost of a Netflix subscription, we could get back to those 80s levels. From the 90s to 2014, the population increased about 30%, yet annual investment in housing has decreased by over 46% in that same period, leaving more and more people at the mercy of a ballooning free market. And it turns out the feds didn't use their austerity tactics to help those most in need. From 93 to 2013, subsidies for affordable housing dropped, while billions more in tax cuts were handed out to wealthier homeowners. Paired with the financialization of housing, this led to the crisis we face today, leaving hundreds of thousands on the waitlist for affordable housing, unable to realize their inherent right to shelter. Because after all,
housing rights are human rights. Everyone deserves a safe and affordable place to call home, and we will introduce legislation to ensure that future governments continue to take steps to support access to adequate housing.
With such a bold and concrete statement, you'll be shocked to learn that years later, Trudeau's Liberals still haven't solidified this human right into law.
The National Housing Strategy represents a once-in-a-generation $40 billion vision of how we can protect the affordability of the current affordable housing stock in Canada, build 4 times as many units as the past decade, repair 3 times as many units as the past decade, and reduce chronic homelessness by 50%.
But as we've seen, not only is it not enough to meet yesterday's needs, comparing your plan to even the last 2 decades is an extremely low bar. Only 15,000 new units will be built each year, 3/4 the pace of the early 90s, and that's if no future governments make austerity cuts. Of course, these things take time, but thousands of units won't even break ground for nearly a decade.
Even once a project is approved, it can take 2, 3, 4, 5, upwards of 7 years to get those homes built.
So we need to make a public housing revolution central to our recovery plan, starting by reclaiming empty buildings so no one has to sleep on the streets this winter or ever again, and bringing new ideas like community land trusts, communal living, and Green New Deal style retrofits for a new national community housing program. But we're gonna have to bookmark that story for next time. Thanks so much for watching. I know in part 1 I promised I'd get to solutions, and then I only brought you more bad news, so hit the dislike and drop some Fs in the chat for Mayors Morden and Tory. And subscribe so you don't miss the thrilling conclusion to this housing trilogy. Quadrilogy? I don't know. Special thanks to my patrons who help keep the lights on. I'll see you next time, and until then, always waffle to the left.